They don't talk about this enough. Nobody warns an empath about what repeated pain actually does to the mind. Because the first time an empath gets hurt, they forgive. The second time, they try harder. The third time, they blame themselves. And that is where the destruction quietly begins. You see, empaths are not weak people. They are people who feel everything at full volume. Every disappointment, every ignored message, every cold tone, every fake promise, every emotional betrayal. And the terrifying part is, most empaths suffer in silence while smiling in public. People think the empath is fine because they are still kind, still answering, still helping, still loving. But internally, a psychological war has already started. Because when an empath is hurt repeatedly, their nervous system changes. Their brain starts expecting pain even in peaceful moments. And eventually, they stop relaxing around people completely. This is why many empaths suddenly become distant for no obvious reason. It was never sudden. You just didn't notice the thousands of tiny emotional cuts before the silence arrived. An empath can survive pain, but repeated disappointment from people they trusted, that changes their entire personality. At first, they over-explain themselves. Then they become quieter. Then one day, they stop explaining at all. That's the dangerous stage. Because when an empath stops expressing pain, it doesn't mean the pain disappeared. It means the pain went deeper. Most people think heartbreak destroys the empath. False hope destroys them more. Being emotionally manipulated destroys them more. Being made to feel too sensitive destroys them more. Imagine constantly absorbing other people's emotions while nobody understands yours. That's the hidden exhaustion empaths live with every day. And after enough hurt, something shocking begins happening internally. The empath slowly disconnects from their own emotions. Not because they stopped feeling, but because feeling became too dangerous. Psychology calls this emotional self-protection. The mind literally creates distance between the empath and their own vulnerability. That's why some empaths suddenly become cold after years of being loving. It's not cruelty, it's survival. And here's what most people never realize: the empath remembers everything emotionally. Not just words, energy, tone, facial expressions. Moments when they felt unwanted. Moments when they felt emotionally abandoned. Those memories stay alive inside them for years. That's why repeated hurt affects empaths differently than normal people. They replay emotional pain internally like a movie that never fully ends, and eventually their trust system collapses. Now watch this carefully, because this is where it becomes psychologically terrifying. Once an empath reaches emotional exhaustion, they stop fighting for connections, and when an empath stops fighting for you, you've already lost them emotionally, even if they still text you, even if they still smile at you, even if they still sit beside you. Internally, they already left, because repeated hurt teaches the empath one brutal lesson. Love without safety becomes emotional poison. That sentence alone changes lives. And this is why many empaths suddenly isolate themselves from the world. People call them antisocial, but psychology sees something different. Their brain associates closeness with emotional danger. So isolation starts feeling safer than attachment. Read that again: internally. Isolation starts feeling safer than attachment. That is not peace. That is emotion. Burnout, and the scariest part, most empaths don't even notice this transformation happening. One day they wake up emotionally numb, unable to trust, unable to open up, unable to feel excitement around people anymore. The same person who once loved deeply now struggles to believe anyone is genuine. Repeated emotional pain rewires them. Most people think pain changes an empath emotionally, but they have no idea how deeply it changes them psychologically. Because when an empath gets hurt repeatedly, the damage does not stay in the heart. It travels into the nervous system, into the mind, into the way they see human beings forever. The first betrayal usually doesn't destroy the empath. It confuses them. Because empaths naturally believe in emotional honesty. They believe if they love deeply, other people must feel deeply too. That's their first mistake. They assume hearts work like theirs. So when someone lies to them, uses them, ignores them, or emotionally abandons them, the empath doesn't immediately become angry. They become reflective. They sit alone replaying conversations, replaying expressions, replaying moments, trying to understand where things changed, and that is the beginning of psychological exhaustion, because the empath does not simply feel pain. They analyze it emotionally until it consumes them internally. Most people move on from hurt externally. Empaths absorb it internally. That is why repeated emotional pain affects them differently than everyone else. Every disappointment leaves emotional fingerprints inside their mind, and after enough heartbreak, their brain starts adapting to survive. This is where everything changes. The empath slowly becomes hyper-aware of emotional danger. A delayed reply suddenly feels suspicious. A cold tone suddenly feels threatening. A small change in behavior suddenly feels like abandonment. Not because the empath is dramatic, but because repeated pain trained their nervous system to stay alert. Psychology calls this emotional conditioning. The brain begins predicting future pain based on past emotional wounds. That means the empath stops feeling safe even during peaceful moments. And people around them rarely notice this transformation happening. Because externally, the empath still smiles, still helps, still acts kind. But internally, their mind is preparing for disappointment before it even arrives. Imaginary. I live like that every day. Imagine entering every relationship with invisible emotional bruises nobody can see. That is the hidden reality of many empaths. And the terrifying part is they usually blame themselves for it. They ask questions like, maybe I'm too sensitive, maybe I expect too much, maybe I care too deeply. So instead of protecting themselves, they try harder. They love harder. They forgive faster. They tolerate behavior that slowly destroys their self-worth. And toxic people recognize this immediately. Because emotionally selfish people are drawn toward empaths for one reason. Empaths keep giving chances after the warning signs appear. That is why repeated hurt becomes so dangerous. The empath keeps reopening the same emotional wound, hoping this time the outcome will be different. But every betrayal deepens the damage. Every broken promise weakens trust further. Every emotional manipulation teaches the empath something darker about human nature. Eventually, their brain stops associating love with safety. Read that carefully. Their brain stops associating love with safety. And once that happens, relationships stop feeling comforting. They start feeling exhausting. That's why some empaths suddenly become emotionally distant, even around people they love. Their nervous system no longer relaxes during connection. It stays alert, watching, preparing, expecting disappointment before happiness even fully arrives. This is why repeated pain changes the empath at a biological level too. Stress hormones remain elevated longer. Sleep becomes restless. Overthinking becomes constant. Their body physically struggles to relax around emotional uncertainty. People think the empath is overreacting. Their nervous system is surviving. And survival mode changes people completely. The empath who once trusted easily now questions everything. The empath who once opened their heart freely now hesitates before expressing emotions. The empath who once believed words now studies behavior instead, because repeated pain taught them one brutal truth. People can say beautiful things while secretly destroying you emotionally. That realization changes the empath forever. And nobody talks enough about the loneliness this creates. Because the empath still craves genuine connection. They still want love. Still want closeness, still want emotional safety. But now fear exists beside every attachment. Fear of betrayal, fear of abandonment, fear of emotional disappointment. So internally, the empath becomes divided. One side wants connection, the other side wants protection. And this psychological conflict drains them every single day. That's why many empaths suddenly disappear socially after repeated hurt. It's not attention seeking. It's emotional recovery. Their mind becomes exhausted from constantly carrying emotional weight nobody understands. And here's the heartbreaking part. Most empaths hide this pain incredibly well. They continue supporting others while silently collapsing internally. They continue listening to everyone else's problems while nobody notices their own emotional exhaustion. Because empaths are masters at concealing pain. Not because they enjoy suffering, but because they became used to nobody truly understanding it. That sentence alone explains years of silent suffering. The empath eventually learns that expressing pain often changes nothing, so they stop talking. And once an empath stops expressing emotions openly, the pain starts turning inward. This is where numbness begins. Not healing, numbness. There's a difference. Healing brings peace. Numbness removes feeling. The empath starts disconnecting emotionally because feeling everything became unbearable. And when an empath reaches emotional numbness, even happiness struggles to reach them fully anymore. That's the cost of repeated emotional pain. It doesn't only weaken trust in others, it weakens connection to themselves. Some empaths stop recognizing who they used to be, the version of them that laughed freely, trusted easily, loved openly, believed people were genuine. That version slowly disappears after enough emotional betrayal. And the scariest part? The transformation happens slowly enough that nobody notices until the empath becomes completely different. One day people suddenly say, "You changed," but they never ask what caused the change. They never ask how much pain it took to create that silence. Because emotionally damaged empaths do not become louder. They become quieter, more distant, more guarded. And internally, they start grieving the person they used to be. That is the hidden psychological tragedy of repeated emotional pain. The empath loses safety first, then trust, then emotional openness, then eventually pieces of their identity. And when someone repeatedly hurts an empath, they are not just hurting feelings, they are reshaping the empath's entire emotional world. Every betrayal teaches caution. Every disappointment teaches emotional restraint. Every manipulation teaches self-protection. Until eventually, the empath no longer recognizes love the same way anymore. Now love feels dangerous. Attachment feels risky. Vulnerability feels unsafe. And the person who once gave endless warmth to everyone around them now struggles just to feel emotionally secure inside their own mind. People fear the anger of an empath, but they should fear the silence more, because an empath does not become silent overnight. Silence is not their first reaction. First, they try to communicate. They explain how they feel. They give warnings nobody takes seriously. They speak softly about things hurting them internally. But the terrifying part is, most empaths are ignored long before they finally go quiet. People only notice the empath's silence. They never notice the thousands of emotional moments that created it. And that is what makes this transformation psychologically devastating. Because when an empath stops talking, it usually means they are emotionally exhausted beyond words. Not weak, not dramatic, exhausted. There's a dangerous stage every empath reaches after repeated emotional pain, a stage where explaining themselves starts feeling pointless, because they realize something heartbreaking. The people hurting them already understood. They just didn't care enough to stop. That realization changes the empath internally forever. At first, the empath over-explains. They write long messages. They replay conversations. They try desperately to make people understand their emotions. Not because they want attention, but because empaths believe emotional honesty can save relationships. They think if they explain the pain clearly enough, the other person will finally understand. But repeated disappointment slowly destroys that belief. The empath begins noticing a painful pattern. Every time they express hurt, they are called too sensitive. Every time they express needs, they are made to feel difficult. Every time they speak emotionally, their vulnerability gets minimized. And after enough experiences like this, the empath's mind starts associating emotional expression with emotional danger. Read that carefully. The empath no longer feels safe expressing emotions. That's where silence begins. Psychology understands this deeply. When emotional openness repeatedly leads to rejection, criticism, or invalidation, the brain adapts by shutting down expression. Not because the feelings disappeared, because the mind is protecting itself from further damage. That is why quiet empaths are often carrying the loudest pain internally. And nobody notices because they mastered hiding it. The empath still smiles in conversations, still replies politely, still supports everyone else emotionally. But internally, they stop believing anyone truly hears them. That is emotional exhaustion at its deepest level. The terrifying thing about emotional exhaustion is that it doesn't always look emotional. Sometimes it looks calm. Sometimes it looks detached. Sometimes it looks detached. Sometimes it looks like the empath doesn't care anymore. But that's not what happened. The empath cared too much for too long. That's why they became silent. People think silence means the empath is healing. Number. Sometimes silence means the empath has reached emotional overload, a stage where the nervous system can no longer process. We disappointment the same way, and once an empath reaches this stage, their personality starts changing slowly. The person who once responded instantly now disappears for hours or days. The person who once fought for connection now withdraws emotionally. The person who once shared everything openly now keeps their inner world locked away. Not because they became cold, because openness became dangerous to them psychologically. You have to understand something powerful about empaths. They feel rejection deeply. Even subtle emotional shifts affect them internally. A different tone, a colder response, a lack of effort. Empaths notice emotional changes most people completely miss. And when those emotional disappointments happen repeatedly, their mind becomes exhausted from constantly absorbing emotional pain. Eventually, they stop expressing what hurts them because they expect disappointment anyway. That expectation destroys communication internally, because silence is not always peace. Sometimes silence is surrender. The empath silently giving up on being understood. That is one of the saddest psychological transformations a human being can experience. Imagine wanting emotional closeness. Your entire life, then slowly learning that vulnerability only leads to pain. Imagine training yourself not to speak about hurt because every past attempt ended in disappointment. That changes people deeply. And the scariest part? Most people notice the empath's silence only after it's permanent. That's when panic begins. Suddenly people ask, "Why are you distant? Why did you change? Why don't you talk like before?" But by then, the empath is already emotionally disconnected internally, because silence was never the beginning. Silence was the final stage, the final result of repeated emotional neglect. And once an empath emotionally detaches, bringing them back becomes incredibly difficult, because they no longer trust emotional safety. They no longer trust vulnerability. They no longer trust that expressing emotions will lead to understanding. Instead, their brain expects disappointment automatically. That expectation creates emotional isolation even in crowded rooms. And many empaths live like this for years without anyone realizing it. Surrounded by people, talking normally, functioning daily, but internally feeling emotionally alone. That type of loneliness destroys people slowly, because the empath doesn't need constant attention. They need emotional sincerity. And when sincerity disappears from relationships, their soul starts retreating inward. This is why emotionally exhausted empaths often crave solitude. Not because they hate people, because silence feels safer than emotional invalidation. Solitude becomes the only place where they stop feeling emotionally misunderstood. And over time, that solitude becomes addictive, because peace alone starts feeling healthier than connection with emotionally draining people. Now watch this carefully, because this is where it becomes psychologically powerful. The empath's silence is often misunderstood as weakness, but in reality, silence is sometimes the only remaining defense mechanism they have left. They stop arguing because they're tired, stop explaining because they're tired, stop chasing because they're tired. And exhaustion changes behavior more than anger ever will. Anger is loud. Emotional exhaustion is quiet. But emotional exhaustion destroys relationships far more permanently, because anger still contains emotional energy. Silence often means the energy is gone completely. That's why when empath finally stops reacting, it should terrify the people around them. Because empaths usually endure pain far longer than they should. They forgive repeatedly. They understand repeatedly. They give second chances repeatedly. So when that person finally becomes emotionally silent, it means something inside them finally broke. And broken trust changes the empath permanently. The warmth disappears slowly. The emotional availability disappears slowly. The effort disappears slowly. Until eventually, the empath becomes emotionally unreachable. Not because they want revenge, but because survival taught them distance is safer than vulnerability. And people rarely understand this until it's too late. They mistake the empath's patience for weakness. They mistake forgiveness for endless tolerance. They mistake silence for healing. But internally, the empath was emotionally bleeding in places nobody could see. That's why some of the kindest people suddenly become the quietest. Because emotional exhaustion steals the part of them that once believed connection was safe. And once an empath loses that belief, their silence becomes louder than any words they could have spoken. The most dangerous thing that can happen to an empath is not heartbreak, it is awakening. Because once an empath finally understands how much pain they tolerated, they never see people the same way again. And this transformation shocks everyone around them.
Why?
Because the empath who once gave endless chances suddenly starts saying no. The empath who once stayed available for everyone suddenly becomes selective with their energy. The empath who once tolerated emotional disrespect quietly suddenly walks away without explaining, and people call them cold for it, but they are not becoming heartless. They are becoming aware. There's a massive psychological difference between those two things. A heartless person stops caring because they lack empathy. A healed empath becomes selective because they finally learned self-protection. That lesson usually comes through pain, repeated pain. Because empaths naturally believe love means sacrifice. They think loyalty means endurance. They think understanding others means tolerating behavior that slowly destroys them emotionally. So for years, they overgive, overforgive, overextend themselves emotionally. Until one day something inside them changes permanent. Lie. The empath finally realizes a terrifying truth. Not everyone deserves access to their energy. That realization feels like waking up from emotional hypnosis. Suddenly, the empath starts remembering every moment they ignored their intuition, every red flag they excused, every disrespect they minimized, every emotional betrayal they forgave too quickly. And internally, they begin grieving how much of themselves they abandoned just to keep other people comfortable. That grief changes them forever. Because healed empaths stop asking one dangerous question: how can I make people stay? And they start asking a new question instead: why am I abandoning myself to keep people who hurt me? That question transforms everything psychologically. Because for the first time, the empath stops viewing themselves as responsible for everyone else's emotions. That is the beginning of emotional freedom. And emotionally free empaths become extremely powerful people. Not loud, not aggressive, powerful in a quieter way. They stop begging for understanding, stop proving their worth, stop chasing emotional validation from people incapable of giving genuine love. And once that shift happens internally, their entire presence changes. People can feel it immediately. The empath becomes calmer, more observant, harder to manipulate emotionally. Because pain taught them what words alone never could. Now they pay attention to consistency instead of promises, behavior instead of charm, energy instead of appearances. And this is where toxic people begin losing control over them. Because emotionally unhealthy people survive through access. Access to your kindness. Access to your forgiveness. Access to your emotional availability. But healed empaths stop giving unlimited access. That's why some people become angry when an empath heals. Read that again carefully. Some people benefited from the empath having weak boundaries. So the moment boundaries appear, they call the empath selfish, cold, different. But the truth is far deeper than that. The empath is no longer willing to destroy themselves emotionally just to maintain connections that drain them. That is not selfishness. That is psychological growth. And growth makes the empath dangerous to manipulative people, because healed empaths no longer react the same way. They stop over-explaining themselves, stop arguing with emotionally dishonest, people. Stop trying to save relationships that only survive through their effort. Instead, they quietly detach, and quiet detachment confuses people more than anger ever could, because the empath no longer needs the last word. They no longer need revenge. They no longer need people to finally understand the pain they caused. That emotional independence is terrifying to people who once controlled them emotionally, because healed empaths stop operating from fear. Fear used to control them. Fear of losing people. Fear of abandonment. Fear of disappointing others. But healing changes the entire emotional system internally. Now peace becomes more important than attachment. And once peace becomes the empath's priority, everything changes. They become selective with conversations, selective with relationships, selective with who gets access to their emotional world. Not because they hate people, because experience taught them energy is valuable. And the empath finally understands something most people learn too late. Protecting your peace is not cruelty, it is survival. That sentence alone can change someone's entire life, because many empaths spent years believing boundaries were selfie. So they tolerated emotional chaos constantly, allowed people to cross lines repeatedly, stayed loyal to people who continuously damaged them internally. But healed empaths stop confusing suffering with love. That's one of the biggest transformations of all. They realize love should not constantly require emotional self-destruction. Love should feel emotionally safe, consistent, honest, mutual. And once the empath experiences genuine peace internally, they become unable to tolerate fake connections anymore. That's why healed empaths often lose many relationships during their transformation. Not because they became worse, because they finally stopped betraying themselves. And people who benefited from the empath's self-sacrifice usually cannot survive the new boundaries. Now here's the most powerful part of all. Healed empaths do not become emotionless. They still love deeply, still care deeply, still feel deeply. But now their empathy includes themselves too. That changes everything. Because before healing, the empath gave compassion to everyone except themselves. Now they finally protect their own emotional well-being with the same intensity they once protected others. That's true healing. And once an empath reaches that level internally, their energy becomes different. They stop forcing connections, stop begging for loyalty, stop shrinking themselves emotionally just to avoid losing people. Instead, they become comfortable walking away from anything that threatens their peace. That confidence is rare, because most people stay emotionally trapped inside unhealthy connections out of fear. But healed empaths understand something powerful. Loneliness is temporary. Emotional destruction lasts much longer, so they choose peace. Even if peace requires distance, even if peace requires solitude, even if peace disappoints people who once had unlimited access to them. And this is where the empath becomes emotionally untouchable. Not because they built walls, because they built wisdom. There's a huge difference. Walls are created through fear. Wisdom is created through experience. The healed empath no longer trusts blindly, but they also no longer fear being alone. That's the real transformation. Because emotionally dependent people tolerate disrespect to avoid abandonment. Healed empaths would rather walk alone than stay where their soul feels unsafe. That mindset creates an entirely different level of emotional strength. And once an empath reaches that stage, they stop needing external validation completely. They no longer measure their worth through attention, through approval, through who stays or leaves. Their value becomes internal, stable, untouchable. And people notice this shift immediately. The empath who once chased understanding now protects peace. The empath who once overgave emotionally now gives selectively. The empath who once tolerated emotional pain silently now leaves the moment respect disappears. That transformation shocks people because they were used to the old version, the version that endured everything quietly. But healed empaths do not abandon others. They simply stop abandoning themselves. And once that lesson becomes permanent internally, the empath becomes one of the strongest people psychologically in the room.